am the only unbought and unbossed politician. Why should I step back?
This is UNBOUGHT Power Hour with Rasha Mubarak.
Welcome.
Hi.
Good to see y'all.
Welcome to Instagram, Leila.
I'm not really here. Thanks, girl.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you both so much. I know, Leila, you had to create an Instagram account. Yazan get it up super early. So I just appreciate you all so much for being here. I know a lot of folks are excited about this conversation. And so I just want to kind of jump right into it. I want folks to know a little bit about who you all are, and talk a little bit about your background, whether it's your Palestinian story or your organizing background, and just talk to us a little bit about yourselves. Yazan, you want to jump into it?
Sounds good. So hi everyone, my name is Yazan. I am an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement in Southern California. And then I also am someone who does a lot of research activist work. So I'm a community organizer with an organization called Vigilant Love that does a lot of work fighting Islamophobia and structural impacts of the war on terror, specifically looking at mental health and how it's co-opted by DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm a really, really proud and excited member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So super happy and grateful to be here.
Welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan. Leila?
Hey everyone, I'm Leila. I use she, her. I am currently residing on Piscataway land, and I also am an organizer. I'm a member of Palestinian Youth Movement, proud member of Palestinian Youth Movement, and a proud member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And I've been doing Palestine organizing for a few years now, and have really been looking at the intersections in my organizing, primarily at the intersections of policing and carceral systems here in the U.S. With Israeli occupation and sort of global structures of militarism and oppression. And I'm really, really excited to be doing more explicitly feminist work, because of course that is a piece of all the work we're doing, but through PFC is really an opportunity to do it more explicitly. So I'm very excited for that.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to be the dork for a moment, but it's so good to see y'all's faces, because it really takes me back to just the inception of Palestinian Feminist Collective. And I honestly didn't know you both personally beforehand, but being in that space, being in the Palestinian Feminist Collective, for me has been something, growing up in this movement, in this work, it can be so lonely, so marginalizing on so many sides of the aisle. And to have a space for our diaspora that not only welcomes and encourages, is not made out of, because we're always in constant crisis response, but to collectively build together this Palestinian Feminist Collective, because there were so many gaps, and a group of feminists, a group of femme siblings came together and said, we want to create and build a space where we fill those gaps. So for me, that's something, it was a dream for so long, and here it is, a Palestinian Feminist Collective. And not only is it here, but we've been able to launch a pledge that we'll get into later. So if someone could talk to a little bit about these gaps, that so many of us have experienced, as whether we're Palestinian or Palestinian activists, fighting for freedom and liberation for all people, what are these gaps that we are able to detect, so many of us, that are not new, and what we were hoping to really achieve through the collective?
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Rasha, and just share your excitement. And it's been such an honor and an amazing experience to get to work closely with people like you and so many others through the collective. And in terms of some of the gaps and sort of political conditions that were, that were impacting us as Palestinians and Arabs trying to do this work, that we're really like looking at responding to through the formation of the collective. And maybe we can say a little bit more about how the collective was formed in a little bit. But the conditions that we're looking at were like, first and foremost, Zionists really pushing people like us out of feminist spaces, for starters. So really like developing a strong presence in those spaces and looking at groups like the Women's March, for example, where individuals like Zahra Bilo and Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsoud, like all folks who are very unapologetically, for Palestinian freedom in some, different ways, we're getting pushed out of that space. And we're seeing that there was not an adequate sort of communal response on our part, like on the part of Palestinian and Arab communities, not a real adequate response to that happening. And we're really looking at that as like an issue, and sort of connected is just like, the development or the emergence of Zionists, for example, which is this movement group that is like trying to establish like a very strong progressiveness that is explicitly Zionist, and their stated sort of mission is like, or their stated sort of definition of Zionism is a movement for liberation of Jewish peoples in their indigenous homeland. So this claims to
look at them using those buzzwords. It's so.
It is. That's definitely something to get into. Is just that the use of our language. So the emergence of Zionists and its strong presence in progressive spaces, closing out like our people in those spaces, and then the sort of liberal feminists, and I'm using like air quotes there because they're not feminists. These people who are using Orientalists, who are really uplifting Orientalist views of Arab and Palestinian women, and who are promoting sort of women's rights, the sort of individualist, white, liberal approach of women's rights, while also forwarding imperialism and settler colonialism. So that like basically that approach of not looking at the racism and settler colonial narratives and structures embedded in their approach to feminism. We have that whole group of folks that we're responding to. And also just to name as well, and Yazan would love for you to jump in here, but there's also a lot happening sort of on the ground in Palestine in 2019, specifically an amazing emergence. I mean, building obviously for a long time, but the formalization of this group Talat was really like responding to intense gender-based violence in Palestinian communities, but saying very clearly that occupation, Zionism, all of that is totally connected to the violence we're experiencing in our communities, totally shapes the violence we're experiencing in our communities on an interpersonal level. And there is no freedom for Palestinians, no freedom for our people without freedom from sexism, without freedom from racism, without dismantling all these other structures. And they're basically, organizing mass protests and putting out this message loud and clear and saying to the rest of the world, join us in explicitly saying, no free Palestine without freedom for everyone, without the dismantling of all of these oppressive structures. So that's like a little bit of the conditions and the landscape that we were sort of emerging from or responding to. Yazan, I don't know if you have stuff to add to that.
Yeah, I think one point that you were making, maybe like a little bit halfway, Leila, you used feminist in air quotes, and I think what's really important to look at is how feminism is really, really weaponized. Like the basic definition of feminism, if it includes Zionism, we in the Palestinian Feminist Collective really see that as a contradiction. There is no movement that's actually for justice if Zionism is included, because Zionism is a capitalist project, it's a colonial project, it's an anti-Black racist project, and it's an anti-feminist project. So Zionism relies very heavily on gendered violence to further itself. And you can look at historically, right, leading up to Nakba, you can look at how eugenics policies were implemented. Women who were Zionist settlers were given incentives to birth more children. You can look at how, on the flip side, Palestinian pregnant women have always been targets of the Zionist institution because they're going to be birthing more potential quote-unquote terrorists. So really thinking about how Zionism from its inception has relied on specifically gender and reproductive facets of gendered violence to further itself, I think is a really, really basic way to understand, like, there is no way to separate Zionism from gendered violence. This is in addition to all of the other really violent ways that Zionism has used horrific types of violence that include gendered violence, like sexual violence, like torture, like all of these different things, in terms of its policing and criminalization of Palestinian organizers. And I think switching over to what Leila was also talking about in terms of how a lot of Palestinian feminists here are criminalized, I think that also really speaks to the power of the Zionist lobby in the United States. Because there are some organizers who are liberal feminists that are Zionists because they believe in Zionism, and there are some that are bought out before they necessarily know in depth what's happening. And that's not to give them credit, but I think instead to speak to the fact that the Zionist lobby in the United States really runs so much of the political scene, even what people consider to be the quote-unquote left in the United States. Zionism is just everywhere in every possible way. There's every flavor of Zionism for wherever you are on the political spectrum in the United States. So that way they always have a grip on what kinds of political conversations are happening. So I just wanted to say that I agree a lot with how Leila is laying things out and breaking things down. That gap is really important. Yeah.
No, thank you all for, and it's interesting because just how, and I know that we said probably get into it later, just how they use progressivism as a tactic, right? Like their PR system is so strong. They use words that you would find in movement that has really trickled down into social justice spaces, and specifically here, feminist spaces. As we talk about and think about how liberal feminists, they use these identities or these terms to really undermine the collective aspirations of Palestinian feminists and our co-strugglers. As a Palestinian feminist collective, we thought one of our first projects should be a pledge that will basically draw a line in the sand that Palestine is a feminist issue, to y'all's point. So does someone want to go into just the origin of the pledge, how it came about and what it's about? And of course, we'll talk about how folks can sign on to it. And we had so many amazing movement people sign on to it that we can get into later, but it just goes to, it's gone international, and it gives people an opportunity to not just sign on to a pledge, right, but to be a part of a space where we're going to literally love and protect one another, but provide the resources to equip you with the right language once we're able to understand how Palestine is a feminist issue.
I'm happy to start, and then maybe Leila, if you want to add on whatever I'm missing. But for the Palestine Feminist Collective, we had a lot of discussions about how to launch ourselves and what ways to start thinking about making our name known and building our partnership base more formally. And so we know as individual organizers, as people part of organizations, as academics, other kinds of professionals, that there are a lot of people across the United States who identify with different racial or ethnic struggles, with different gender justice struggles, with different struggles around labor and class, disability justice, queerness. Like all of these spaces are all very clear in their affirmation of anti-Zionism. They are all like, we do not believe in Zionism. We know that Zionism is a roadblock to collective liberation. And so when we know this as organizers on the ground and can see how there's so many organizers that know that Zionism is in no way something that can lead to justice, but at the same time, the sort of maybe popular, or not popular, a strong word, because it's not based on people, but the mainstream narrative that US government kind of generates is that Zionism is progressive, Zionism is about freedom, Zionism is about democracy, when that's what we're seeing all the time in news spaces or in political spaces, campus organizing, all of these things, there's a contradiction. If the organizers who are really the ones that form the critical mass or the left on the ground in the US, if those are the folks who are saying we don't believe in Zionism and we know that Zionism is something that harms all of us, but somehow the United States progressively defines Zionism as something that will further democracy and freedom, that's a problem. So how can we kind of leverage that understanding between all of our radical partners on the ground, where we're naming, we know that Zionism is something that is oppressive, that it is repressive, that it furthers capitalism, anti-Black racism, colonialism, among so many of the other isms. And so that was our goal, was how can we band together all of these people across the United States, some of our transnational partners, into really talking about how Zionism is something that is a roadblock to collective liberation. And then on the flip side, we were like, okay, let's also think about, for the folks who maybe can be bent or pushed, how can we also use this as an educational tool? So folks can use this as a conversation starter, folks can think about it more in depth. And when people see, for example, if you are an organization who says, wow, I really take nod from BYP 100, or I really take nod from Gabriella, or these different kinds of things, and you yourself have not checked your Zionism, and you're seeing your partners do that, it's also supposed to serve as some sort of moment where these folks can think twice. Like, how is it that these organizations that I am aligned with are saying something that I haven't interrogated myself as an organizer or an organization? So that was also part of the goal. It's really trying to push back against or encourage people who could be pushed, or organizations who could be pushed, to think more in depth. I don't know if Leila, you want to add anything else?
Yeah, that was beautiful. I'll add a couple things. I mean, I think that we talk so much about the importance of joint struggle and the interconnectedness of our struggles, the interconnectedness, the interlocking sort of nature of systems of oppression, and how much we need to be supporting one another, in solidarity with one another, like fighting these systems together. And at the same time, like, there needs to be deep education to really make that work possible, and deep relationship building. So I think that it's definitely like what Yazan was mentioning about folks sort of seeing the pledge and doing some work themselves. I think that's totally on point. And we really, it's a very strong value and intention of ours to use the pledge as a tool to start some real intentional education work with folks who need it. Because I think that we have so many people out there who are aligned and who want to support, but are also like lacking some basic education. And we're expecting solidarity and expecting them to sign on, sometimes without doing the actual like work to go over the history, go over the complexities, and also the real simple aspects of this, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not that complex. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that this is going to be a real jumping off point for us to do the needed education work with a lot of groups we want to be building with, and that we ourselves want to also be supporting, and deepen the relationships we need to ultimately win against all of these structures. And I also think that another piece of the pledge is it's education for our own communities. It's a tool for moving and doing work in our own communities around gender, around structures and systems of oppression. Like, we've had enormous responses from Palestinians and Arabs, responding to the pledge. It's created really dynamic and lively conversation already, and that's the power of of this kind of tool, right? Is like, they're enormous conversation starters, and really hoping to deepen that sort of internal communal conversations. Y'all can probably speak more to this, but I just wanted to name that piece and say that, like, this is all about laying groundwork also for future campaigns, right? The pledge is an organizing tool that we really are going to be building on to ultimately, I think, like, shift policy and shift like material conditions.
Thank you so much, y'all. Absolutely. When you were talking, Leila, about the piece of just like, even within our community, I think for a long time, our diaspora here within the U.S. borders, we wanted to create a space where it wasn't just specific to one constituency base, right? That we included all the different struggles, right? But we also wanted to make sure it was layered and consistency when we're talking about the different struggles. So that's why I know that Yazan mentioned the different things that we make sure that we touch upon as a collective. We do have 6 demands in the pledge. Do we want to talk about that? Do we want to name it? Do we want to list them? And we can elaborate on the ones that we need to.
Totally. It's great to have them out there. So I'll read them out. And if we want to drop the link to the pledge in the chat, I don't know if that's possible, but
so if we can do that, but folks can also go, if they go to my profile, it's in my link tree, but I don't even know how to chat with these 3 people here. So, but if someone listening, I think Mesa's in the room, Sharif's here, I can't see who else is here.
We got some homies in the room, for
sure.
So
I see Sada. So if you just put it in the chat, we'll get
it in the chat, in the comments, and I'll just say the demands. So this is basically, the pledge is saying, or asking groups to join us in fighting for a truly intersectional and decolonial feminist vision for the United States, Palestine, and our world. And in doing so, pledge to embrace and advocate for Palestinian liberation as a critical feminist issue. Number 2, support Palestinian rights to free speech and political organizing everywhere. Number 3, reject the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, in particular the legal enforcement of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. That's the IHRA definition. Number 4, heed the call of Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Number 5, divest from militarism and invest in justice and community needs on Turtle Island. Number 6, call for an end to U.S. political, military, and economic support to Israel and to all military, security, and policing collaborations. Those are the demands, and this pledge is building on so many decades of movement organizing and drawing from inspiration from so many different sources and groups and movements. And we're very proud of it, and also want to really name name how much this work has only been possible through all that decades of work before us.
I think too, if it's all right to add,
Of course.
something that Leila was touching on in the last point about how the pledge is a tool for community as well. I'm thinking also about how, there's a coalition that the PFC is starting to build a relationship with called the Partnership to End Gendered Islamophobia. And a lot of the like overlapping work that the Partnership to End Gendered Islamophobia looks at is like the structural impacts of war, the war on terror, on people who identify as Muslim women or queer Muslim folks, but then also the interpersonal or like intra-communal harm that they experience through like patriarchy, misogyny, and anti-queerness, which I think is exactly what Leila is touching on. And I really want to uplift that point that Leila was making about how this can be a tool for those conversations and how we really see the PFC as a bridge that's trying to hold space for all of those complexities. I think with what Leila was talking about, sometimes there's a push to maybe, like, I think it's usually framed as not airing dirty laundry or being hesitant or anxious to fully name the like impact of gender-based violence in depth for fear of normalizing Zionism or normalizing Islamophobia or normalizing NGOs that use really problematic frameworks when they do like try to help women and other folks flee violence. So like at the end of the day, what that means is there are women and queer folks who are caught in that web, who are being forced to stay silent for the sake of the larger national struggle, when in some instances that framing means that the larger national struggle means it's at the expense of you. And so I think like it's a really hard conversation to have, and it's one that requires a lot of nuance because we see it as there's a direct relationship between living under Zionist oppression and how that also contributes to increased domestic violence and gender-based violence and interpersonal violence. And so that's also something that I think gets erased a lot, is that violence is very cyclical, and for us we see it in those ways. And so I think I really just want to uplift that point that Leila was making earlier, because I do think that there is a healing component to the work that the PFC is trying to take on in terms of thinking about how to support community, meet community where every community member's at, which is a very different, like everyone is at a different point. Even within the PFC, we're all at very different points with the politics and with ourselves. So just wanting to name that for us, an understanding of how much there is a causal relationship between interpersonal violence and state violence, and trying to create a community and a resource list for both of those things at the same time is really important in the PFC.
Thank you, Yazan. I'm glad that you talked about that, you and Leila. I wanted to ask y'all also just on that point, is I think Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is here. Hello. So on that point, is something that we talked about is once, we do provide education and information and tools and equipment for folks to better advocate for Palestinian freedom and understand what true feminism is. But going back to the tactics and the tools of the opposition, we see that they do use these different struggles, right? So it does confuse people who are trying to be progressive. And I say, because progressive is thrown around, but something that they'll do is they, for instance, if some LGBTQ issues, and even Yazan, you mentioned the Islamophobic piece, you'll have Zionists combating Islamophobia, but so people will be like, oh, well, this is a two-sided, this is the people that are fighting for your people, and they get it, right? And it just confuses some people because here they are combating Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, they're fighting for immigrant rights, right? So it adds this layer of progressivism, right? But like you said, a lot of the gendered violence, a lot of the Islamophobia is layered in the Zionism movement. And if someone wants to talk about that and how, even elaborating on pinkwashing, how that's used.
I'm happy to start, and then if you want to jump in, Leila. Um, I think, well, I guess when you were talking, Rasha, one thing that came to mind is actually the Pulse shooting in Orlando. But this is an example of U.S. politics here and its connections to pinkwashing. But the ADL, a lot of like goes over a lot of people's heads because it was local Florida newspapers. But the ADL actually had really powerful responses to. So after the Pulse shooting, the mosque that Ahmad Mateen went to was burnt down in a hate crime. And it was burnt down by dozens of white supremacists who had been intimidating and harassing the people who went to the masjid for a long time. But after that mosque was burnt down, the ADL released a statement, which is the Anti-Defamation League for folks who don't know. And they are an organization that really posits themselves as progressive, as anti-racist, as anti-Islamophobia, as all of these things. So they named how sorry they were. And they said, as an organization that that has been persecuted for our own beliefs and our faiths, we are sorry to the Muslim community of Florida for the fact that Ahmad Mateen's actions led to this. We don't believe in Islamophobia and we're sorry. And so for people who are unfamiliar with the ADL, it looks like a really minor thing. It's like, whatever, okay, this other organization that supports religious communities and all of these things is doing this. But at the same time that the Pulse shooting had happened, you see a huge influx in a lot of pinkwashing. So Netanyahu released a statement about the Pulse shooting. And in Israel, there was also a person who had sent and paid for a plane to fly over Florida that with a banner that said, Orlando, Israel feels your pain. And so their connection was, you guys experienced terrorism, and we ourselves always experience terrorism, and we also are a beacon of progressivism. And so we know what it's like to be furthering modernity in the Middle East and be like tried for that, because Ahmad Mateen here was phrased as a jihadist, homophobic person. And so there was a lot of reliance on these really, really specific details that when you look at them in isolation might not mean much, but then within a year or two, the United States, that's when CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, was really launched. And immediately following the Pulse shooting in Alameda County, a multi-million-dollar grant was allotted to Alameda County police, and it was in the name of LGBT safety. So there was an emergency meeting in response to Pulse. And all across the U.S., police and private police were added to queer clubs, to pride festivals, all of these things. And Black and queer people of color across the U.S. named, like, after Pulse, we experienced way more police harassment in our own spaces. We experienced way more interrogation. We felt way more uncomfortable because now there's an influx of police. And so thinking of this, just to think about how there is a really complicated relationship with pinkwashing that's even experienced here in the United States, where like Islamophobia is presumably like not being furthered, but at the same time, legislation that is inherently Islamophobic, that is inherently Zionist, is allowed to be passed. And then on the flip side, if we're thinking about back home, thinking about pinkwashing and how there are a lot of ways that how in Israel, in the Zionist entity, there was a passing of legislation to quote unquote further gay rights, but that was to further participation in the military, right? So it's a very nationalist and it's a very violent project. It's not necessarily for the like out of the concern for people who identify as queer. And even then it's a very normative queer. It's LGBT, it's very cisgendered, it's very classed and these kinds of things. So just thinking about how there's a really, really clear relationship between militarization, securitization, and queer rights for the United States and for Israel is really important.
Woo!
And I'll just jump in. I'll just jump in a little bit to add to that brilliance that, you know, the ADL, I think, represents so much of what it's a very similar type of beast in terms of like the Zionist and liberal feminists. What I mean by that is like they have this very individualist, right, sort of like rights-based approach, and it's all about like anti-hate. It's really truly all about anti-hate and anti-bias, and it's very individualist. And this is also so much of what we're seeing among like the liberal feminists, and again feminists and Zionist feminists, is like no analysis of structural oppression and systemic oppression, and no critique of settler colonialism within that, of imperialism within that, of white supremacy within that. Like they have this individualist approach and are not looking on a structure level, on a systems level, and not looking at settler colonialism and imperialism, and that is creating so much damage, and that's sort of what we're up against, and what third world feminism and intersectionality and all of these movements are about, is like pointing out the structures piece. And they are, they're specifically, they are trying to beat us by using our same language, but they're still failing to actually take on the fullness of the analysis, and actually like go far enough to see that they're upholding settler colonialism and imperialism, and that they're only taking sort of little pieces here and there, the fancy words. They're not actually deep in the analysis that Black and brown feminists are putting forward.
No, thank you, Yazan, and thank you, Leila, especially for bringing up Pulse. As someone from Orlando, who, it was such a hard time just for, as Orlando residents, as a Palestinian Muslim person living in Orlando who has queer friends and allies. We were mourning so many different aspects of it, the Islamophobia, the anti-Palestinian, and how it translates into policy and legislation. We saw some discrete Islamophobic legislation try to be passed, where they said, no, if you can't fly, you shouldn't be out by a gun. And we all know that people on the no-fly list.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And these were like social justice groups. And I was like, wait, stop. That ain't it. And then, the anti-BDS legislation passed, I think, that year. We had 5 no votes that came from Orlando, and the JCRC sent someone from DC. He told me to my face that he was there to disrupt the advocacy that I was doing, like my little tiny advocacy. And basically he was gay. He had a Ramadan iftar. I can't, the things that happened, the disparaging, undermining within my own circles. And it was just but he's having a Ramadan interfaith iftar, Rasha. He wrote, Joel gotta go. There was an Islamophobic tax collector, but at the same time called me out. So I feel that hard. So I appreciate you highlighting that. Going back to the pledge is as a beacon of hope and as an opportunity for folks to really be a part of something, but also learn more and be educated, be equipped. Let's talk about the signatories. We knew it was straight fire, and there was so much intent, and it was literally collectively put together, and every single word in that pledge, right? But it went international. We had several signatories. We had Black abolitionists. So we want to talk about where we're at with the signatories amount, who we reached, who's on there.
Yeah. So we have over 3,000 signatures, both that's individuals, but it's also a lot of groups that have signed on. And just in terms of some of the amazing, fantastic individuals, among the signers, we have Black abolitionist feminist Mariam Kaba, we have Chicana feminist Shari Moraga, incredible feminists Chandra Bahanti and Judith Butler. We've had groups signing on and individuals signing on all around the world, Australia, Kenya, South Africa, Chile, all corners, and some really amazing organizational endorsements, organizations like Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Black Women Radicals, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, JBP, Jewish Voice for Peace. There's so many, honestly, so many. I'm going to stop there with organizations, but just wanted to name a few, and also just a huge number of Muslim organizations, Christian organizations, Jewish orgs. Really got a big interfaith mix in there as well.
Amazing. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to, if folks in the chat want to put in questions, we may or may not get to it. But we went ahead and pinned Mesa's comment to the chat where you can access the pledge if you haven't already signed on to it. So as you know, we give folks an opportunity to put some questions in. I wanted to ask, taking it back, zooming out, aerial view, what does it mean when you're saying Palestine is a feminist issue?
I can jump in here, and then Yazan will pass it to you. So we're really looking at feminism as a liberation, like a liberatory framework and movement. And that's specifically like looking at structures and systems of oppression, right? Not individuals, not hate and bias in this individualized sort of framework. So it's about collective liberation, and we're really saying, not that Palestine is only a feminist issue, but that it is an issue that is fundamentally about dismantling structures of oppression, apartheid occupation, white supremacy, sexism, patriarchy, all of these things. And it's about dismantling those structures, and of course that occupation and apartheid and Zionism have also very specific sort of gendered components that we need to also be looking at. So it's both about like how this is about, combating all structures of oppression, and that's what feminism is, but it's also looking at some of the very specific gendered components and gendered aspects, gender-based violence, femicide, and how those things are very connected to the ways that Zionism and the Zionist movement have specifically targeted women, femmes, queers, trans folks, with certain types of violence that maybe, I don't know if Yazan you want to speak to a little bit more. Yeah, I'll leave it there and see what Yazan wants to add.
Yeah, I think with the framing that Leila is giving out, it's also like, so there are folks who had asked us questions previously of like, why are you naming Palestine as a feminist issue? It's more than that. And so I think Leila very explicitly saying not just was a clarification we didn't necessarily think we had to make. But I guess like there are people who are maybe hesitant or questioning that. And so piggybacking off of Leila, I think like she very clearly named that there are gendered components of Zionism. And so building on more of that, I think it's also thinking about how like part of the questions around why name Palestine a feminist issue, there's that like unspoken anxiety and sometimes very explicitly named anxiety of not wanting to seem Western aligned or Western sympathetic. Like it's this kind of very like there's this anxiety around using a framework that might be considered United States based or might be considered liberal or Western white, that some communities have, that some community members have, that some organizations have. And so I think from what Leila's talking about, also affirming that in the same way that Palestine is a feminist issue among many other types of issues, it's also like feminism itself or gender justice itself is not a United States like value. It's not a value of the US. It's not a value of Europe inherently. Like these are settler colonial nations that use a lot of imperial violence. And so I think it's really important to clarify that where we take our direction on gender justice is our own people and our comrades who have really built out strong analysis and strong strategies in communities of color, in Black communities. And so I think earlier, before we started, Leila and I were talking about the different folks that brought us here, like the different either scholars or organizers or different folks. And there are so many feminist or gender justice groups and thinkers that really are also people that criticize imperialism, criticize Western movements. And so I guess I'm just naming that to name that there are ways that sometimes like there's the anxiety around just reducing Palestine to a feminist issue as if somehow feminism doesn't also mean anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, when for us it means all of those things.
Right.
And then also that where we take our direction is not from the people who perpetrate the violence. It's from the people who struggle against it. And so I think just thinking about those two things from what Leila is saying is really important to center for the PFC.
Thank you both. So Instagram does this really weird thing where like after exactly 1 hour it'll shut out. But I know that I think we started around 12:15. I wanted to ask you both, being Palestinian, being knees deep in this work since very young ages, how do you continue to choose to be UNBOUGHT and how that relates to PFC, considering obviously we will always choose to be Palestinian if it was a choice, but you can't stop being Palestinian, you can't, our different identities, but if you want to share a story, but how do you continue to take care of yourself in this work and being UNBOUGHT?
I can start because the PFC is part of the answer to that question. Yeah. First, I think that I just also want to start by naming that it is in so many ways a real struggle to I guess like the term UNBOUGHT, I want to just say that like the structures are such that make it incredibly hard to stay UNBOUGHT, and I think that it's really, really important to name that like some people don't necessarily have the choice, I mean everyone has the choice, but I would never want to like go into sort of like shaming and that kind of thing. Just acknowledging how challenging our lives are under capitalism and all the other structures. So I want to kind of start by saying that, but in terms of just like my own work and my own sort of journey, I would really say that deep relationship building is a huge piece of it, and really being deeply sort of centered and rooted in sort of the work of my ancestors, of our ancestors, doing this, building these movements, and the responsibility I feel to keep that work going and to think about the different privileges I might hold and also the ways that I am, on the other end of certain structures in terms of power structures, the way I'm both impacted negatively and also privileged by certain structures, thinking about all those things, my positioning, what and my responsibility and what work I'm sort of called to do based on all those things and like well positioned to do. And and really like grounding in my answers to those questions and in my relationships. And in terms of the PFC, I want to say that like a huge focus of the PFC is to do things differently in terms of our organizing and our movements, and to really center relationships sort of at the core, to center care for one another, to center our sort of full humanness. And that is so much sort of like going against and a challenge to the way that organizing has happened in our movements because of the structures we're operating under. So we're really like choosing to care for one another, embrace one another's full humanity, knowing that that's what's going to keep us in the work, that's what's going to sustain us, that's what's going to keep us unbought. And I make sure that, oh my goodness, okay, we're almost at time. But for sure, we want to just welcome, for folks out there who are listening to this, we want to welcome people to the PFC, to join the PFC. Like, Rasha is probably a great person to hit up if you want to join. But just want to say that this is like, we want to be welcoming people. I'm going to pass it over to Yazan, but wanted to say that like we want folks to join. That's a major thing.
Thank you so much, Leila. I realized I did this, but I guess it's this now, right? Yazan.
To be honest, my first response when you said, how do you remain or stay unbought, was like, I know I'm unbought if I'm still tired, because we just do so much organizing work. But I think really just thinking about how like struggling in community, like I think that for me is like the major source of life. I think like even though like I don't see myself as someone who's like necessarily defined by or weighed down by struggle, but at the same time, it is something that for me is a moving force. And being able to do that with so many comrades and other folks and peers, like I think that is the most meaningful thing. I think to me, there is a lot of meaning lost and a lot of fire lost when you start slowly allowing yourself to become more and more absorbed by institutions. I think like the spirit of life and like the soul of life, it really comes from the things that are intangible. And I think struggle, there's so many material impacts of struggle, but the like power to keep pushing through alongside community, like that's something that can never be recreated unless you're just in it and doing that. And so I think that for me is the major force. But yeah. And also wanting to echo Leila about inviting people to join or to contact us. It's really nice to build with new people. I've gotten to meet so many wonderful people. I mean, even through this, I've gotten to meet and build with Rasha. I've gotten to know Leila more. I think there are so many ways that we get to deepen our relationships when we choose different kinds of work together. And it's work that's really building up the struggle in the end, which is so powerful and important.
Thank you so much, Leila and Yazan. Appreciate and have so much deep love and gratitude for you each. And of course, our PFC family who showed up hard today. We see you. And thank you, Mesa. The link is pinned in the chat. You can always go to my link tree. But like Leila said, this is meant to look different. It's going to feel different because we hope to be a collective force for so many co-strugglers, including Palestine, of course. And please keep yourself educated on what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah right now. There's a lot happening, and also happy Easter to those observing today, and Ramadan Mubarak. Much love, rage, and love. Love y'all.